Most people believe life changes slowly. A promotion, a new city, a long conversation that shifts everything. But sometimes, life changes in 3 hours at 35,000 feet. Because of the stranger who happens to sit next to you. This is the story of Elliot Harper. And the stranger who changed his life on a flight he almost didn't take. Elliot Harper sat at gate 42 staring at his boarding pass like it was bad news. Chicago to Seattle. 3 hours and 50 minutes. He hadn't slept in 2 nights. The divorce papers had arrived that morning. 12 years of marriage reduced to a manila envelope and a signature line. Elliot wasn't angry. Just empty. When boarding was called, he walked onto the plane slowly, carrying nothing but a small backpack and the quiet weight of starting over at 41. Seat 17A. Window. He sat down and leaned his head against the glass. For a moment he wished the flight would just disappear. But then someone stopped beside him. "Excuse me. I think that's my seat." Elliot looked up. The man standing there looked about 65. Silver hair. Navy blazer. The kind of calm smile you usually only see on people who have already figured life out. 17B, the man said gently. Elliot stood to let him in. The stranger settled into the seat and buckled his belt. For the first 10 minutes they said nothing. The plane taxied. Engines roared. And just before takeoff, the stranger turned slightly. "Tough week?" Elliot blinked. "How could you tell?" The man smiled. People who stare at airplane windows before the plane even moves are usually thinking about something heavy. Elliot almost laughed. "Almost." "Divorce," he said quietly. The stranger nodded once. "I see." And then, silence again. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt patient. 30 minutes into the flight the beverage cart rolled past. Coffee for Elliot. Tea for the stranger. A few minutes later the man spoke again. "You know something interesting about airplanes?" Elliot shrugged. "They're the only place where 2 strangers are forced to sit together long enough to actually talk." Elliot smirked. "Or ignore each other completely." "That too," the man said with a grin. He extended his hand. "My name is Samuel Whitaker." Elliot shook it. "Elliot." Samuel leaned back slightly. "So Elliot, what do you do when your life suddenly doesn't look like the one you planned?" Elliot stared at his coffee. "I don't know yet." Samuel nodded like that answer made perfect sense. "Good." Elliot frowned. "Good?" "Yes," Samuel said calmly. "Because the worst decisions are made by people who think they already know the answer." For the next hour, Samuel told a story. 40 years earlier he had been sitting on a flight almost exactly like this one. He was 30. Recently divorced. Completely certain his life had collapsed. "And do you know what the man sitting next to me said?" Samuel asked. Elliot shook his head. He said, "You think this is the end of your story, but it might just be the chapter where your real life begins." Elliot stared at him. "What happened after that?" Samuel smiled softly. "I changed everything." He quit the job he hated. Moved to a city where he knew no one. Started a small business with money he barely had. "Everyone thought I was crazy," Samuel said. "Were they right?" "Absolutely." Elliot laughed for the first time that day. "But sometimes," Samuel continued, "crazy is just another word for brave." Elliot sat quietly. The plane hummed steadily through the clouds. "And did it work?" Elliot asked. Samuel looked out the window for a moment. "Yes." Then he added something unexpected. "But not the way I thought it would." Samuel turned slightly toward Elliot. "You see, I spent years thinking success would fix everything. The business grew. I made money. Bought houses. But the most important thing that happened. He paused. Was realizing my life wasn't supposed to look like my old one. Elliot swallowed. That's the part I'm struggling with. Samuel nodded. Of course you are. Then he said something Elliot would never forget. Grief isn't just losing someone. It's losing the future you imagined. Elliot felt that sentence land somewhere deep in his chest. For a few minutes neither of them spoke. Just the quiet sound of the engines. Then Samuel leaned forward slightly. So here's a question. What's the one thing you've always wanted to do, but never did? Elliot didn't answer immediately. Then he sighed. Open a small woodworking studio. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Why didn't you? Because it wasn't practical. Samuel chuckled. Practical is often the enemy of meaningful. The captain's voice came over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent into Seattle shortly. Seatbelts clicked. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. Elliot looked at Samuel. You know, this might sound strange. But I'm really glad you sat here. Samuel smiled warmly. I was thinking the same thing. As the plane lowered through the clouds, Elliot felt something he hadn't felt all week. Not happiness. But possibility. When the wheels finally touched the runway, the passengers began gathering their bags. Elliot turned to say goodbye. But Samuel handed him a small folded card. Open it later, he said. At baggage claim Elliot finally unfolded the card. Inside was a short handwritten message. Elliot. 40 years ago a stranger on a plane reminded me that life doesn't end when plans fall apart. Today I simply returned the favor. You don't need permission to begin again. Samuel. At the bottom was something else. An address. And a note that read. If you ever open that woodworking studio, send me a photo. Elliot stood there in the busy airport for a long moment. People rushed past. Suitcases rolled across the floor. But for the first time since the divorce papers arrived, he wasn't thinking about what he lost. He was thinking about what he might build. All because of the stranger who sat next to him on a plane.